The One Piece and Laugh Tale can be found on the moon. The story of One Piece ends with Luffy traveling to space. There was in fact a time when this was pretty much the biggest One Piece theory in the community, and we have Enel to thank for that. When we got his cover story and his adventure to the Endless Verse, it was almost as if an aspect of the world of One Piece was kind of unlocked. Suddenly we see space as a different kind of ocean. Planets and moons more like islands, and those islands once had inhabitants. Even though it's desolate now, the moon was the ancestral home to the winged people. But it is not as though space is empty now. Enel met literal, I repeat, literal space pirates, traveling aboard their spaceship, mining resources on this now abandoned moon. And I think that it's natural to see this and think about where the story of One Piece, the adventure of the story, leads next. Eventually, every aspect of the blue planet will be explored, and the only thing left will be space, the final frontier. Jean-Luc Picard. I think that if Luffy lives long enough, he will one day adventure in space. But I'm not totally convinced it will happen within the story itself. If you were asking me, space isn't important because it's a place that we will go. It's important because it's a place that we've already been. We now know through Vegapunk that the ancient kingdom was highly advanced, beyond our wildest dreams. And I promise you, some of us dream very wildly. If space pirates is not obvious enough, space travel has its place in the One Piece world's history. And by following the clues and exploring the connections, we might gain a greater understanding of the world as it is now and the world as it once was, and why these two things are not the same. If you've been enjoying all the theory videos and you're hyped for this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe, just let me know that you want more. And with that being said, let's begin.
Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So,
maybe some of you are wondering right now what this video is truly about. What is it that I'm going to try to speculate? You guys know I can't tell you that. It would ruin the surprise. So I'm asking for a little patience here. Sit back, relax, enjoy the ride. As this is a theory or speculation about things that we don't really know yet that will undoubtedly be revealed at some time in the future, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of area where you have to fill in the blanks and sort of make decisions. What do you want to believe? As an example, let me pose this hypothetical question. Because of cave art, it is highly implied that the winged races, the Skypians, the Shandians, and the Birkins, originated from the moon. We see their lost city. What we don't know, though, is when they actually moved there. Is this where they were always from? Were they there for thousands of years? Or maybe they had only recently arrived. Now, One Piece doesn't have to follow science, but I'd like to talk science for a moment. I mean, we're in Egghead after all. Now is the time to strike. So science with me, at least for a little bit. Based on what we know right now, it would seem more improbable for intelligent humanoid life forms to develop on a moon than a regular planet. And there's two main reasons for this. Essentially, a lack of an atmosphere and a lack of a magnetic field. If you travel to the poles of the Earth, you can see the Aurora Borealis, which is in effect physically seeing our magnetic field. This is created from our molten magma core, as well as convection currents from hot to cold within it. So in places where you can see our magnetic field, it is insanely beautiful. It's also incredibly important. It's kind of like a shield, protecting us from the particles and radiation of the sun's solar wind. So keeping the core of the Earth hot is important, because like everything else, it does very slowly cool down. And in this case, the size of the celestial body matters. Our moon, for instance, I think almost entirely lacks a magnetic field. It isn't just weaker, it is non-existent. Bear in mind that science constantly evolves their thoughts and theories about everything, but the general reason that is attributed for this is the size of the moon, the core cooled. As an interesting aside, it's commonly believed that Mars at one point in the distant past was a habitable planet, not that dissimilar to Earth, although Mars is significantly smaller. But obviously today it's cold and desolate, and the common theory for why this is the case is that Mars lost its magnetic field. Because once this happens, a planet loses its atmosphere. And an atmosphere is incredibly important in regulating the surface temperature of a planet, essentially keeping the surface warm. I didn't bring this up, but it's also commonly believed that water is kind of essential for the development of life. Liquid water. Also, your atmosphere also protects from harmful solar radiation. Anyway, without a magnetic field, although this is not entirely true, you could basically think of this solar wind blowing the atmosphere away. But of course, how much atmosphere a planet can hold also depends on its size, its gravity. There's a Goldilocks zone, so to speak. Don't want to be too small, but also don't want to be too big, generally speaking. All of this was an incredibly long, but I hope interesting explanation for why it's very unlikely for life to develop on a moon, with some exceptions we will not be discussing. But even further than this, life itself seems improbable, meaning that intelligent life is even more so. So based on science, do I think that the winged people originally came from the moon. No. In my opinion, they must have somehow traveled there from the blue planet. Or a distant planet, I guess. Now, to totally discredit my first point, right? Actually traveling to the moon in the world of One Piece is not quite as difficult a feat as it is on Earth. The term is unscientific. We see the automata use literal balloons. Also, the winged people traveled from the moon back to the planet also using balloons. This is in fact a thing. But we also see in Enel's cover story that the inhabitants of Burka on the moon didn't live on the surface. The surface is presented much like our actual moon. They lived below the surface, with the apparent assistance of technology, probably for some pseudoscientific reason, like protection against the sun's radiation or its solar wind. So for this to really make any sense, for them to have developed a civilization on the desolate moon, it requires them to already have had pretty substantial technology, regardless of whether they could have gotten there easily using balloons. I understand some might speculate that maybe at some point in the past the moon was vibrant, right? Full of life, and then it just died and everyone moved below ground. But if that was the case, we would see remnants of this past on the surface, without a doubt. So did the winged people live on the moon for thousands of years? Once again, in my opinion, no. So all of this leads to my speculation that the city of Burka on the moon was not an ancient civilization. It was something more akin to a colony. Before they could actually settle there, the technology on the blue planet itself needed to progress so that they could literally make the moon habitable. But we know for a fact that sometime in the distant past, related to the Void Century, technology on the world of One Piece advanced exponentially. So much so that they far surpassed what Vegapunk could actually achieve. I believe that most assume that all of this occurred during the Void Century. But actually some of the advancement might have predated that. In a recent theory, which I'll link in the description, you can watch when it's convenient for you to do so, we discussed elements of this. The idea that some of the races in the world of One Piece were bioengineered. The premise was effectively, if science and scientists could do it now, then the ancient kingdom could do it better. And if there's a technology that's less than what Vegapunk and other scientists in the world of One Piece are doing now, then it might very well predate the ancient kingdom. As an example, we know that Judge Vinsmoke was able to splice the DNA of his children with that of various kinds of creatures. Oda gives us a visual of this. For instance, the Vinsmoke exoskeletons is probably related to the physiology of insects. So based on this, it is not totally inconceivable for Judge Vinsmoke to, right now, be able to create the race of fishmen, or minks, or tantara, etc. Hell, even the winged people themselves could be bioengineered. You splice in the lineage factor to give them pretty much useless ornamental wings. This might in fact be foreshadowed to some small extent because we see some of the winged people look like sheep, as if they might have some mink lineage factor, what should in fact be impossible if they've always been isolated living either on the moon or in the Sky Islands. But anyway, to repeat for emphasis, I think that Judge Vinsmoke could create the winged people today, if he desired that. And so if science today could do this, then it is less than the level of the ancient kingdom, meaning it's an older technology. But as for an example that's very specific and obvious on the moon is we know that the ancient kingdom developed the Eternal Flame. This was their ultimate power source. But when Enel visits the moon, we learned that the moon was powered not using the Eternal Flame, but rather electricity. Enel turned it back on using his devil fruit powers. So I think it's fair to speculate that by the time that the moon was abandoned, they hadn't yet developed the Eternal Flame. And all of this makes an absurd amount of sense because by the time that the Void Century occurred, we already know that the moon was abandoned because the Shandians were living in Jaya. Oda explicitly revealed this in chapter 261 of One Piece. The city of Shandor thrived over 1,100 years ago. That is what Robin read on a monument. So the winged people left their moon before the Void Century, meaning the technology that is found there and the automata almost definitely predate the ancient kingdom. So once again, I hope all of this was interesting, but the point is you need to develop a headcanon to fill in the spaces that will undoubtedly someday be revealed, but is not revealed currently. So putting all of this together, my belief is that technology began to develop on the world of One Piece far before the Void Century, even though the Ancient Kingdom might have collected all of this and improved upon it. I do think most, if not all of the races of the world of One Piece were bioengineered, including the winged people, but excluding groups like giants. My more specific theory is that most of the races that we are familiar with were actually created as tools of war. The fishmen were sea soldiers. The minks were soldiers of the forest. Buccaneers, your general purpose super soldiers. And this might have even applied to the Lunarians. Like the Seraphim today, developed sometime later, they were the perfect weapon, with dominion over the sky, until they conquer the world, that is. For the Sky People, however, I think that they were literally developed to go live on the moon, very shortly after space travel was developed. And I personally do not believe that the colony lasted very long, only a few hundred years or less. Let's linger for a moment on this theory about the Lunarians. Maybe it's partly related to how the Lunarian DNA is being used in the present story, but there's a certain scientific feel about the Lunarians. When comparing them to every other race in the One Piece world, they seem especially unnatural. And I think that it has a lot to do with their flames. As always, you have to bear in mind that this is the world of One Piece, and it is a truly unique place to live. However, naturally evolving flames as part of your body is pretty extreme, even for One Piece. Especially with how the Lunarians' flame seems to be unique, granting either inhuman speed or straight up invulnerability. As an interesting point here, somebody who showcases a similar ability is Sanji, an actually confirmed modified human. So when the Lunarians were first introduced, the community immediately picked up on this and wondered if there was some kind of connection between Sanji, specifically the Venspoke children, and the Lunarians. Maybe it was possible for Sanji to possess Lunarian lineage factor, similar to the Seraphim. But unfortunately, I don't think that this theory has held up over time. And the main reason for this is that Sanji is unique. If Judge Venspoke utilized Lunarian lineage factor in the creation of his children, you would see it present in all of the children. But as so far, none of the others have been able to utilize fire in the same way that Sanji does. Some might argue, however, that all of the Venspoke possess unique abilities, and perhaps fire is meant to be Sanji's power. Yet I don't think that that holds up either. We discussed this in a recent theory I'll also link in the description, Sanji, power of a star. But a theme shared between all of the children is the ability to manipulate a certain type of energy. And the Venspoke children's epithets, their raid suits, and their demonstrated powers are clues to this energy's nature. So in my opinion, it's clear that when Judge designed Sanji initially, he was supposed to be stealth black, with a primary power of invisibility, which isn't related to fire, as far as I'm aware. So in that video, we instead speculated that Sanji's fire powers actually are derived from technology given to him through Sora, his mother. But I don't think that Sora attempted to splice Sanji or the other children's DNA with that of Lunarians. One of the more genius aspects of the Whole Cake Island arc was Oda's use of the theme of love. Sanji is portrayed as a character who loves more than everybody else, and Oda used it as a weapon against him in the arc. From the very beginning, Sanji was lured to Whole Cake Island because of his love for his mentor, Zeph, and the threat to Zeph's life. Sanji also chose to go alone and did not ask the Straw Hats to follow him because of his love for them. He did not want to involve them in his problems and potentially lead them to their deaths. I think that you can also say that Sanji was maybe encouraged just a little bit because of his infatuation or love once he saw Pudding, and that quickly led to heartbreak. Anyway, we could go into more detail, but I think at this point you get it. Oda's purpose in Whole Cake Island with Sanji was to utilize his love to make him suffer. And it's incredibly relevant because this is most likely something that Judge Venspoke experienced as well. So much so that he probably broke and decided love to be a burden. Naturally then, when he decided to create his super children, he removed their capacity for love, or compassion, viewing it as a weakness which would lead to suffering. In chapter 852 of One Piece, we learned that Sora, Sanji's mother, had a problem with this. To put it mildly, don't do this, they're my children too. If you erase their hearts, they won't be human anymore. Which of course to this, Judge did not listen. So fittingly, in an act of love, Sora effectively killed herself in order to restore her children's hearts, or their love. And it's my theory that she did this the only way that she knew how. She treated love as a distinct form of energy, the same as which all the Venspoke children can naturally utilize. But as Sanji has literally explained pretty much every time that he brings up his fire-related abilities, the source of that power is love. So if there's a similarity between the Lunarians and Sanji, I believe it to be convergent evolution, or I suppose convergent science. The flames of both are related to either love or different emotional states. And I totally understand, guys, that fire is not necessarily a Sanji-specific power. I didn't bring up Luffy, Red Rock, and Red Hawk, but that's because my conspiracy tinfoil theory is that Luffy is also a descendant of augmented superhumans from the Void Century, and he is not alone. Remember, guys, the Lunarians were once considered gods, but the timeline in which they were gods is not precisely explained. But for me, this makes the most sense for this to have been the case before the Void Century, so more than 900 years ago, effectively after the Ancient Kingdom rose to power during the Void Century itself. The Ancient Kingdom surpassed Vegapunk, who had actual Lunarians to base his research on in order to create the Seraphim which have surpassed the Lunarians, probably. Long story short is all the augmented humans and races that we've been talking about so far are before the Void Century. There might be some that actually came from the Void Century, and individuals like Luffy or Zoro, Big Mom, could have possibly inherited elements of this lineage factor, diluted over time. Man guys, I think this is the first time in a long time that I feel like I've gone wildly off track. We're keeping it anyway because it is fire, literally. The very nuanced point of all this is to make an argument that the Lunarians were not always gods, as I do not think that they always existed. They acquired this title, just the same as the celestial dragons after them. Very similar to reality, I believe that the world of One Piece has always worshipped gods. And again, just like reality, these gods have changed. Obviously, it's been the celestial dragons for 800 years. But before them and during the Void Century, I believe that this was a title held by Joy Boy and Nika. I'm sure some will hate this thought because the idea of a Luffy-like character, which we assume Joy Boy to be a literal god in the world of One Piece, there's something that's not quite right about that. But I'm not saying that Joy Boy desired this title. That was simply what the world viewed him as. And I think that we know this for a fact, because the religion of Nika still exists today. This is something that I feel like needs to be understood. Luffy, the present hero of the story, is soon to be considered by the world at large a god. And maybe this does make a little bit more sense than other examples because, well, there was a Nika of the past which was already a god, so Luffy's kind of taken that role because he ate the fruit. But he is not the only character that is actively being deified. This has come up recently regarding Sabo. They're beginning to call him a god, but the iceberg goes even deeper than that. This was obviously intended to be a joke. We all laughed, but Usopp is the same, God Usopp. And this is interesting because a theory that we made a long time ago that I still think is pretty great is that Usopp is actually of the Nolan family. They simply abandoned their familial name. And just the same as the trajectory of Usopp's story, we see a lot of statues, monuments to Nolan. Nolan was deified. Also from the past, we have the sword god, Ryuma, a title that many expect Zoro to one day acquire. So yes, it's very probable, I would say destined, for these celestial dragons as gods to be dethroned. That includes the Gorosei and Imu. But the world is already preparing their next candidates, from one god to the next. Despite this being what I would say is a pretty sensitive subject, I do expect this to become a prominent part of the future of the story. It's possible one of the goals of One Piece is to end the cycle of worshipping god kings. Kurozumi tells us that the lore behind the initial D is that they are the enemy to gods. And while we assume this to mean the direct enemy of the celestial dragons, this might refer to gods in all of their forms over the years or centuries. I bring this up often, but I believe the story of One Piece to be a parable of Buddhism, and I believe Ichiro Oda to be Buddhist. So his story reflects and in subtle ways teaches his own ideology. Look no further than Zoro, the actual Buddhist character from the story. He tells us rather explicitly, sorry, I never pray to God. Now obviously just the same as every other religion, there are many different forms of Buddhism, but a Buddhist conception of God is distinctly unique. So we're going to step around this pretty heavily, but I just want you guys to know, I believe that false gods are a major theme in the story of One Piece. A theme that so far Oda has not shied away from, and I do not believe he will intend to in the future. Amidst the incredible joke, there is a reason that Oda made the most human character in the story, Usopp, a literal god. When Luffy and potentially the entirety of the Strats are actively deified in the story, I believe that they will eventually, openly and loudly, reject this title. So again, we have new gods in the future. We have the celestial dragons for 800 years. We have Joy Boy and Nika during the Void Century. I believe that we have the Lunarians before him. But as we argued in the last section, I don't think that the Lunarians always existed. So there was some god even before them. Religious syncretism is the blending of religious belief systems into a new system, or the incorporation of other beliefs into an existing religious tradition. Basically what this means is that all religion that exists today pretty much are formed as a melting pot of religions that came before. As we've already talked about, there are distinct sects of Buddhism which do in fact pray to gods, or a god. And this is in most cases a product of influence of other religion and cultures. This is similar to how most of the Old Testament in Christianity is based on Judaism, or how interwoven in Christian practices and ceremonies is fundamental European paganism. Paganism meaning the worship of many gods and not just one, such as Roman and Greek gods. The celebration of Easter, as just one example, is highly influenced by pagan tradition, which is where all the bunnies and the eggs come in. This happens because as you convert people to a new religion, they retain elements of what they believed prior. For instance, Constantine was noted as the first Roman Christian emperor, and he played a pivotal role in elevating the status of Christianity in Europe. But in order to make Christianity more pervasive, he had to convert Roman pagans. So it's natural that these people developed a combination of both belief systems, and mostly maintained their way of life, as it had always been. This includes things such as Christmas. Romans actually celebrated Christmas on December 25th before Constantine. It just wasn't called Christmas, and it had nothing to do with Jesus. A lot of people have noticed, and there are many theories talking about the similarities between Luffy and Jesus, or Joy Boy and Jesus. Kuma, who worships Nika, carries a Bible which most probably foretells the return of Nika to save the world. Luffy, like Jesus, seemingly in Wano, rose from the dead. He died and was resurrected. But I think that a lot of people get this confused, and I would like to clarify this so that it's better understood. Luffy is not Jesus. He is a literal manifestation or representation of all religion. Romans didn't celebrate Christmas on December 25th. They celebrated Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, or the birthday of the invincible sun. It was a day of worship for the sun god, which by the late Roman period had become elevated as one of the premier divinities. This holiday was characterized by banquets, parties, the exchanging of gifts, and the kindling of lights. A widely held theory is that the Roman Church decided that Jesus' birthday would be December 25th, to match the god Sol, which they already worshipped on that day. As far as I'm aware, the first mention of December 25th being the birthday of Jesus came in 336 AD, during the reign of Constantine. So guys, mind blown or not, the Bible doesn't actually mention December 25th as being the birth date of Jesus. So in effect, to this day, Christians are still celebrating the sun god. It's just that Jesus is the sun god, or an interesting turn of phrase, the Son of God, and they still go to church on the Lord's Day, or Sunday. But the origin of the sun god is far older than the Roman god Sol. The Romans actually took Sol from Germanic mythology, but you can look elsewhere. For instance, in ancient Egypt, their belief of Ra as the sun god. You can go across the vast oceans to the Aztec sun god of Tonatiuh, or Inti, the Incan sun god. The point is, in cultures across the world, we all worshipped the sun in some form or fashion. Speaking of syncretism, I think if we were looking for the first god of humanity itself, a prime candidate would be the sun, and beside it, occupying the sky, is the moon and the stars. So let's bring this back to space. I know you guys are wondering how we got so far off track, but I promise you there is always a vision. I believe that some of the most ancient gods in the world of One Piece is the sun, the moon, and the stars. And just the same as in real-world history, the names and faces of these gods changed, but their worship continues. The most direct evidence of this occurring in the story of One Piece is the existence of the Gorosei. Gorosei literally translates as the 5 elder stars. They are celestial dragons with the actual names of planets. So let's pause, it's time for a little bit more science and history. The planets, despite not actually being stars or suns, are literal stars in the sky. You can take yourself a telescope and observe them. In fact, and this is very important, you actually don't need a telescope if you know where to look. The planet Venus is the brightest star in the sky. But even further than this, if you go to a place with a little less light pollution and you have good enough eyes, you can spot 5 planets. As this is true of you or us today, this was also true of our ancestors. The root word or the etymology of modern-day planet actually comes from Greek, planetes, which meant wanderer. The Greeks, just the same as every other ancient culture or civilization, had a fascination with the stars, and by following and notating their movements, they noticed something peculiar about 5 particular stars, which they could actually see with their eyes before the invention of the telescope. These stars moved, or wandered, more than all of the others. They were the planets. And of course, the Greeks associated these stars with their gods: Hermes, Aphrodite, Ares, Zeus, and Cronus. But of course, syncretism is still a thing. So the Romans renamed the planets after their own gods: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, which is how it is still today. But of course, we know that there wasn't just 5 planets. There are 8 of them, and there was 9 of them as recently as 20 years ago. This includes the additions of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, also including the understanding that the Earth itself is also a planet. planet. We just needed the help of technology in order to find them. So perhaps with this being said, it's now intuitive and obvious to understand that the Gorosei as the 5 elder stars represent the 5 elder planets. It's actually pretty fitting because the Japanese word for star or hoshi can also mean planet. Translating them as the 5 elder planets is accurate. So with this being established, let's ask ourselves a question. Why did Oda choose to name the Gorosei after planets? And my answer is simple and set up from everything in this video beforehand. The people of the world of One Piece, just the same as the people from real world history, at one point in time worshipped the stars. And the special ones had a special place in civilization. Guys, I actually think that there are stars in the world of One Piece that were named Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And the Gorosei stole their identities. Why do I say this, you may ask? Well, it comes from an under-discussed fact revealed in chapter 650 of One Piece. King Neptune was talking about the ancient weapons. He said for whatever reason long in the past, there existed powers deadly enough to destroy the world. 3 ancient weapons bearing the names of gods: Pluton, Uranus, and Poseidon. Guys, the ancient weapons were named after gods, meaning these gods actually existed and were named before the powers of the ancient weapons were born. Speaking of gods of the past yet to be revealed, I think we should be adding Poseidon, Uranus, and Pluto. Coincidentally, 3 of our planets, assuming that Poseidon is translated as Neptune. It would then stand to reason that we could add 5 new gods to this list: Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. Gods that once existed and were worshipped before and or during the Void Century. Have you guys gotten tired of the word syncretism yet? The world government stole the gods of the past, their names, and incorporated it into their own theology, just like the Romans. But I would say it's pretty hard to take the identity of a god, or take the identity of a star. Luffy as Joy Boy is different because the prior Joy Boy is dead. With people who worship stars, it's a bit different. People can see it in the sky, right? So it's like, if you're here and it's there, then you're not it. Quick maths. So what happened to this ancient religion, and how did the Gorosei come to smoothly take the place of these ancient gods, and even take their names? Well guys, in Ohara's tree of knowledge we see in Clover's flashback, there exists a very controversial model of the One Piece world. It's controversial because it depicts the world of One Piece accurately, but surrounding the world of One Piece, we actually see 7 satellites, 6 moons, and 1 moon has a moon, which is really fascinating, considering throughout the entirety of the story, we have only ever seen 1 moon, the moon that Enel visited. And so from this, you hear a lot of people say very definitively, with no uncertainty, that this must be a geocentric model of the world. Geocentric meaning the Earth is at the center. This was actually the first depictions of our solar system that civilizations created. The Earth at the center. Everything revolves around us, including the sun. So based on this, people say that this is a geocentric model. The Earth is at the center, and these moons aren't actually moons, they are planets, which is why we don't see them as moons in the actual One Piece sky. They're just enlarged for effect. But this theory never really made any sense either, because in any geocentric model, you would include the sun, but the sun is not present. So I do think that this is a heliocentric model, and I do think that it depicts moons. They're just moons that no longer exist. But I do think I know their names. Guys, once again, there are 6 moons and 1 moon has a moon. We still have 1 moon in the sky, so 6 minus 1 is 5. 5 former gods are missing. Perhaps we have found our 5 elder stars. So let's bring this all together. In every single major arc of One Piece, there is some kind of impending doom. This can range from weapons to actual people. The bomb in Alabasta, Raigo in the Sky Islands, the sun in Thriller Bark, Shino Kuni, Birdcage, Big Mom herself. This is every major arc, with varying degrees of deadliness. And it's because of this that I highly suspect that when we reach the conclusion of One Piece, there's going to be a threat not to an individual island, but to the entire world. The whole world might literally die. But of course, One Piece is paralleling itself constantly. I mean, like, Luffy is Joy Boy, but Joy Boy was a character that existed during the Void Century. So if I'm speculating by the end of Luffy's story that there's going to be something that's going to threaten the entire world, I'm going to apply this to the Void Century as well. Something threatened to destroy the entire world. What was that? The near simultaneous destruction of 5 moons. With wacky technology and powers and devil fruits that are present in the story of One Piece, it is feasible for the people of the world to prevent its destruction from the falling fragments of the moons. But you gotta wonder if maybe evidence of this can be found littered across the seabed. The result of all of this, a rise in sea levels, covering up most of the land which previously existed. I also wonder if the islands of the Grand Line are composed of large fragments of one particular moon, which had previously had a very unique magnetic field. The log poses actually point to fragments of a destroyed moon. So let's take a deep breath and try to explain all of this, because I'm pretty sure that you have questions, and I'm pretty sure that I have answers. So the Gorosei are the 5 elder stars, and they were literal moons that surround surrounded the world of One Piece, where are the stars of Poseidon, Pluton, and Uranus. So once again here, I think that this could mirror real-world history. The Elder Stars were the ones that you could see, but it wasn't until the advancement in technology, specifically the invention of the telescope, that the other planets were discovered. So in this case, One Piece might have exaggerated reality, bringing the elder stars or planets closer to the Earth, making them moons. However, the new stars were discovered sometime later, coinciding with the advancement of technology that we have speculated just before the Void Century. Despite the celestial bodies, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto being named after ancient Greek and Roman gods, they weren't actually discovered until much after these civilizations fell. So I see this being the same with the stars or the planets Poseidon, Uranus, and Pluton within the world of One Piece. The long story short here is that these remain in the sky as actual stars, requiring advanced technology in order to see. But if we're speculating that these 5 elder stars were actually moons and they were literally destroyed, why were they destroyed? Guys, I don't think that people are aware of just how close humanity itself was to planetary wars. I think many have probably already picked up on how controversial this video could be. There are in fact many emus out there in the world who would like to cover up inconvenient truths. Religious fanaticism is especially guilty of this. During most of the 16th and 17th century, fear of heretics spreading teachings and opinions that contradicted the Bible dominated the Catholic Church. They actively persecuted scientists who formed theories that the church deemed heretical. We've already mentioned geocentric models of the solar system versus heliocentric models. So the Earth at the center versus the sun at the center. What nearly everyone believes today, what is taught in basically every school across the world, was at one point in time heretical. And the reason basically boiled down to the church. The Earth not being at the center of the solar system and the center of the universe challenged our conceptions about our place in everything. So being an astronomer with any integrity around this time was difficult. Two of the most famous astronomers in world history are Copernicus and Galileo. Theories exist that Copernicus waited to publish his book that the Earth revolved around the sun until he was already close to death, knowing the repercussions he would face for doing so. Galileo, unfortunately, was not so lucky. An inquisition was held and he was found guilty of heresy, condemned to house arrest for the remainder of his life. All of this occurred merely because of his belief that the sun was at the center of our solar system. Now guys, I want you to imagine for a second the reveal, knowledge that we take for granted today, that the moon and the planets are essentially lifeless rocks, surrounded by gas, floating in space. Think about how much more controversial this would have been in a time that we believed the stars and the planets to be gods, literal gods. I basically think that this is what played out in the world of One Piece. While the world still collectively believed the moons to be actual gods, technology was developed in order to visit them, and reality was quite different. This became a truth that was fought over. I'm gonna skip some of the details here because I can't possibly know. But I will say that I do not think that it is a coincidence that the winged people, the Shandians, the Skypians, and the Birkins all possess wings which make them resemble angels. The leader of the Skypians is literally referred to as God. The Shandians likewise were subservient to an actual god. This most likely held true in the past as well. The King of the Moon was God. Guys, I have an old video, I'll link it, it's old. But in that we argue that the winged people always possessed the Goro Goro no Mi, or Enel's electricity devil fruit. I believe that the former god king of the moon also possessed this fruit, which is why Enel's electricity powers immediately powered the city. But within this we have an interesting similarity. The Goro Goro no Mi, the wielder of it was a god king of the moon, or a literal moon god. Although I believed that it is spelled differently, there is certainly a similarity between Goro Goro no Mi and the Gorosei, given names that we've speculated were 5 former moons, making them moon gods. It's also pretty convenient that they are celestial dragons. Celestial meaning of the stars or of space, which is why celestial dragons wear spacesuits. So here's what I think happened. With the advancement in technology, the ability to travel to the moon gods existed. Those that did so found an inconvenient truth. There were no moon gods, but I think that they realized that they could use this knowledge. I think astronauts became literal prophets or priests, communing with God itself. And I think that this opened up the opportunity for somebody to become the moon gods, since the world already believed in them. But of course, you guys know, no matter how long it takes, the truth will eventually reveal itself. False gods will eventually be dethroned. I think it eventually became a game of power. Ambitious and knowledgeable people attempted to become these moon gods, knowing that they were just human, likely with powerful devil fruits. And in fact, people attempted to become kings of these worlds. And in the midst of all of this, you have the One Piece equivalent of the Star Wars. Look guys, I know that you have questions about the 6th moon of One Piece, the moon which remains in the sky. Don't worry, we will get to that. Just gotta connect a few more things. I think it was in the midst of some of this that the Lunarians were created, scientifically. I believe that they were the ultimate space soldier, designed to survive in any environment, including that of space. But this technology backfired. The Lunarians were simply too strong, and eventually they rebelled, becoming the moon gods themselves, replacing the humans which had colonized and developed the moons. Lunarian. Luna means moon. I hope you'll forgive me for getting a little bit more headcanon-y than we've been so far, but I think that these were the moon gods, but they weren't yet quite the gods of the blue planet. I think that the gods of the blue planet were dragons, the most powerful creatures. And Oda has foreshadowed this relationship in Wano, at least to some extent, because Kaido the dragon rules over King the Lunarian. You also see something similar with the winged people. While the Skypians still worship God, which we've speculated is essentially a moon king, the Shandians on the Blue Sea worship Nola the snake, which heavily resembles a dragon. So again, we have that word syncretism, the celestial dragons. They've become a combination of two prior religions. So it is my belief, similar to Enel's plan from Skypiea, directly foreshadowed that the Moon Kings or the Lunarians attempted to also rule over the Blue Sea. They attempted to conquer the dragons. Whether they were successful or not, we do not know. All I can tell you is that dragons no longer naturally exist in the world of One Piece. Like the Lunarians, they were erased. But ultimately, the Lunarians themselves were defeated. And I think pivotal to this were space pirates. Space pirates who knew the truth, that the moons weren't gods, and that the moons actually revolved around the Earth, which revolved around the sun. I kind of think that a cult of soul formed, the same as what occurred in Rome. Essentially, people began to view the sun as the one true god. This is where Joy Boy enters the story. I think that Joy Boy was a buccaneer. Lunarians were super soldiers designed for combat in space. So I think that buccaneers were super soldiers designed for combat on Earth. Perhaps at one point the Lunarians employed the buccaneers as their form of the Marines, essentially the police of the sea and land. Joy Boy, however, defected, becoming a pirate, and performed a role 900 years ago similar to the one that we expect Luffy to perform in the present story. He took down the gods, and he revealed the truth. And having done this, he became the king of the pirates, but also the king of the world. And the world itself hailed him as the one true god, the sun god, which then became associated with his devil fruit, the Nika fruit. But the thing is I believe that Joy Boy was very similar to Luffy. I don't think that he thought through what he was doing, nor do I think that he had any interest in becoming a king of anything, or ruling over anything, or conquering anything, or being a god. But what he started couldn't be stopped. You guys know what is likely to happen to the celestial dragons when the world government falls, right? The world will completely annihilate them, as revenge for likely years, possibly centuries of atrocities. It is also true that one of the greatest inspirations for wars over the course of human history is religion. Even if Joy Boy became the sun god, and many worshipped him as the one true god, those prior beliefs were not lost, that the moons were gods too. I think that the fervor of worship of Joy Boy reached a point, similar to the Crusades from European history. Honestly, this should probably be a video by itself, but I really doubt I'll find a place for it anywhere else. But the Crusades are a whole conversation. Let's do this as simply and succinctly as possible. The Crusades, if you are unaware, were a series of religious wars during the medieval period. These religious wars centered around the Latin Roman Christian Church versus Muslims. We've already compared Nika and Joy Boy to Jesus. It's then, I think, fair to compare the Nika Church, which might have been created, to the medieval Catholic Church. What's interesting about all of this is that there's a lot of similar beliefs between Christians and Muslims. So as an example of a similarity, both Christians and Muslims believe in Jesus. When talking about Islam, what you need to understand is they view themselves as the continuation of the religions which came before. They believe in Moses and they believe in Jesus. But this story has continued. But here we've created a theory where the Church of Nika believed the sun god to be the one true god, and attempted to erase or destroy other holy texts. The Church of Nika obviously believed in the sun god, and I think that their enemies believed in the sun god as well. They just also believed in several other gods or prophets. So hopefully with this short description, you guys can understand my comparison with the Crusades. Guys, one of the oldest and most common symbols in human history is the solar cross, essentially a cross within a sun. The actual word cross is derived from the symbol used in Norse mythology. Cross, initially spelled with a K, was the symbol of the cross plus the sun. In Norse, this symbol was used to represent Odin, the king and most powerful of the Nordic gods. It's speculated that this symbol was derived from the rays of the sun, which form a cross shape naturally. But of course, this is also an extremely common symbol in Christianity, the cross with the rays of sun behind it. It's also associated with the symbol of the swastika from more ancient times. So long story short is I think that the followers of Nika, whose symbol is literally the solar cross, were actually the ones responsible for destroying the moons, using the power of the ancient weapon Uranus to prove that the sun was the one true god. And this was something that Joy Boy himself was unable to stop. I already know that people are going to have a problem with this, but this is already an extremely long video. I have another video talking about this concept. I guess I'll put it in the description. But basically the theory is that the story of Joy Boy is very similar to the story of Odin. Because of reasons that the people didn't understand, he failed to act. Eventually he became a joke, even to those who once followed him. But for the context of this video, the theory is basically that the church corrupted and then gained control, possibly using the ancient weapons and their threat in order to blackmail him. So think about a character like Orochi taking command of the church. But despite this, the church still had enemies, the symbol of the sun surrounded by 8 orbs. Basically the people who worshipped both the sun god and the moon gods, including the distant planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Guys, it's this symbol that we see in Kuma's Nika church. Not only the cross, but also the large circle surrounded by 8 smaller ones. This is the sun surrounded by 8 moons. We find this symbol in many places, but importantly I want to highlight the Kozuki clan crest. It is perhaps foreshadowing that all of the daimyos of Wano possess names containing the kanji for moon. Shimotsuke is frost moon, Fugetsu is wind moon, Uzumi is rain moon, Amatsuke is heavenly moon, and Kozuki is light moon. I like to think that these 5 families ruled over or were priests for the 5 destroyed moons, and it's possible that their names describe what these moons were previously like. But of course we're missing one, aren't we? What about the Kurozumi? Well guys, Kurozumi, unlike the others, translates as a black coal, and I think that they worship the moon which remains in the sky. Guys, I don't think that this moon was worshipped quite like the others, because unlike the other 5, it was never properly colonized and could never sustain life. The moon kings or the moon gods effectively disowned it and labeled it as evil, which is why people stopped worshipping it, and also why it was never destroyed. This would also be the moon that I would associate with Blackbeard. We can create a little fable around this if we want to. This was the only moon that was never allowed to become a god, and it held resentment for that fact, ultimately plotting to have the other moons or the other gods killed. But even after this occurred, one god still remained, above all others, the sun god. The moon god's plot, therefore, is to enshroud the world in darkness, block out the sun, so that it may rule over the heavens. Like I said, I believe this to be the moon associated with the Kurozumi, black coal, the unholy moon. It's the new moon or the invisible moon, the one not included as part of the other 8. And its anger lives on today, like Kuro at the very beginning of the story, or the Minks. Simply looking at this moon causes a bloodthirsty transformation. So guys, somebody during the Void Century who was represented by this moon ended up gaining control. They ultimately used the Church of Nika to attack worship of the sun god and of the other 5 moons, as well as the 3 distant planets. Their plan halfway succeeded because they did destroy the 5 moons, but ultimately I think that they were defeated. However, by the conclusion of all of this, Joy Boy and the sun god Nika had become an enemy to the world, for what he personally did not do, and for what his church did do, although a select few knew the truth. Ultimately, the 20 kings which had turned against the Church of Nika, because they worshipped both the sun and the moons, disowned Joy Boy and Nika, as well as the gods represented by the ancient weapons. In the wake of the destruction of the moons, they then created a lie and erased the truth. They told the people that the moons that they once worshipped weren't actually destroyed. The gods simply descended to the earth to rule as they were always meant to. The 20 kings created the Gorosei, and it was easy because the people didn't want to believe that their gods were dead. And so these 5 moons have been ruling ever since, as far as the people are aware. Well guys, what do you think about all that? I sure hope you brought your tinfoil hats for protection. They were needed. But you gotta admit, it's a captivating story. Creating this out of the theory ether is a feat by itself, and if you really sit down and think about it, it's all plausible. There's also a ton of things that I didn't mention, or I just straight up forgot. But I thought, there's only so much time in the day, and the more detailed that you get about all the little nuances of everything, people will just click off the video. It's how it works. I wanted non-stop action, but it's just one example to sort of illustrate the concept, right? In Ohara, we see that the world of One Piece is actually surrounded by 7 satellites. There are 6 moons, that's true, but one moon has a moon. So what happened to that one? Well, I think that when its moon was destroyed, it went on an erratic orbit, and we've already seen it in the story. It sucked up Capone's ship. Or I guess because I can't help myself, let's do a second example. The world government symbol, 5 orbs, representing 5 moons, connected by a cross. But yeah, if you need more convincing, if you want more arguments, go ahead and throw a comment down in the comment section below, and I will try to engage in discussion because this is a lot of fun. But you always need to remember that this is just a theory. Do I believe it? Is it my headcanon? Absolutely yes. Is the story likely to be different? Probably. It do be like that. But the fact that it makes sense and it can stand up to scrutiny is a humongous win. And as always, my objective is very, very simple. I want to make you guys think and just enjoy the experience of One Piece while it lasts. So I hope that you found the nonsense, which makes sense, entertaining. And if you have things to add, do so. But with that being said, let me know what you guys think. If you're interested in checking out my book, The Booms, the link will be in the description. Remember to like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.